I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Center for Health and Social Policy, as well as the Robert Strauss Center for International Law and Security, to an event to talk about global health. Specifically, I'm thrilled to welcome Natasha Bilimoria to talk about Building Effective Advocacy Models, a case study in the Friends of the Global Fight. I had the privilege of introducing Natasha, who is the Executive Director of the Friends of the Global Fight. It is the key advocacy arm for the Global Fund, which as an organization cannot itself do political advocacy and advocacy with Congress and different actors. So it has this adjunct organization that does it for it. Prior to being, I think, the original executive director of this organization, Natasha worked as the acting director of public policy at the Elizabeth Glaser Pediatric AIDS Foundation, where she led its efforts to try to figure out how we fund programs to prevent mother-to-child transmission of HIV. Prior to that, Natasha spent 4 years in the Clinton administration, including part-time at the National Economic Council, where we worked together, working on a wide range of issues, from local community development to Social Security issues to a beginning of this topic, or touching on the topic of global health. She is a graduate of the University of Chicago, has a master's degree from the University of Pennsylvania, and I will say without a doubt, in her field, she's well known for her versatility and her ability to look across a range of topics, her tenacity in terms of trying to ensure that the people ultimately who are served by these programs get what they need from the political and public establishments. And lastly, her compassion, because you can't really work in this field without ultimately worrying on a daily basis about people who are in great need of the services that the Global Fund and these other organizations provide. So with that, I'll turn it over to Natasha.
Thank you. And I apologize that you may have to suffer through my sniffling, which suddenly happened when I entered Austin. So, but thank you all for coming. And I just want to take a minute to thank Robin for all her help in getting me here. But for all the nice things that. Oh, is that better? Better? I'll just hold this. Is that better? For all the nice things Jean just said about me, I would like to throw right back at her. Jean is probably one of the best domestic health people I've ever worked with, and her tenacity and compassion and commitment to ensuring health care for all Americans is something that I hope I can be on the international side. So while we were very sad to see her go from Washington, you all are very lucky to have her here in Austin. So, okay. So I thought, well, we're going to be talking about advocacy. I wanted to kind of give people a good overview on some of the context and background in which my organization and I work in. And I imagine a lot of these facts are sort of already well known to you, but AIDS, TB, and malaria is sort of seen at the moment as being sort of the 3 killer diseases in the world, killing about 6 million people, and mostly poor people a year. And you can see the statistics. And just so you know, on your slides, there's a little bit of a typo. Actually, it's about the numbers for malaria were actually just redone, and there's about 250 million incidences of malaria now that's being seen a year. Before, we were using the 300 to 500 million number, and still about 1 million people are infected with the disease, and 90% of that million are actually children under 5. The thing to note about these diseases is they're all preventable and treatable, and in the case of malaria and TB are actually curable. And based on some of these issues, basically in 2000, the world really came together for the first time to talk about HIV at the Okinawa, Japan G8 summit. And I think everybody agreed that this was the first time that the world's leaders really came around a significant public health issue within the G8 context. And Japan really came forward and took a leadership role by putting HIV on the agenda and actually continued to remain very committed to the fund. But as you can see from this timeline, things moved pretty quickly after that. 2001, The U.S. actually gave the first contribution to the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, and then France and the UK followed. And then obviously 2003 was a big year for the United States in global health, and specifically on HIV, when President Bush sort of surprised the nation with a $15 billion commitment to fight the disease in what turned out to be 15 countries around the world, focus countries. And the Global Fund, obviously, is a piece of the PEPFAR program within the United States, although it is an individual entity, and we'll talk about that in a second. But basically, to date, we've seen almost $10 billion in pledges come to the Global Fund from other countries around the world, including the U.S. And last year, the United States approved $841 million to go to the Global Fund. And since its inception, the U.S. has been and continues to be the largest donor to the Global Fund out of all the countries in the world. So let's talk about the fund a little bit. So the fund was created in 2002 as a financing mechanism to fund these three diseases. And they have a motto there that's really guided by three imperatives: raise it, spend it, and prove it. So on the raise it side, obviously they need to raise significant dollars to fight these diseases around the world. And to date, $11 billion has actually been committed by the Global Fund to fight diseases all over the world. There's still significantly more money and more effort that needs to be put forth to actually really continue to make a dent and hopefully really prevent and put an end to these diseases in the future. The fund spends this money in 136 countries around the world, and they have 555 programs that they're funding in these countries. And then the final step is really proving the results. There are a lot of things that make the fund really unique, but I would say one of the most unique things about it is, unlike a lot of foreign aid programs that we've seen in the past, where money gets distributed and there's not a lot of we don't see a lot of the data coming out of it and seeing what kind of impact we have. The Global Fund was created on a very different model, which is performance-based funding. So while the countries are asking for money, and think of the Global Fund as a foundation in a lot of ways, the countries ask for money from the fund. If those grants are technically sound, the fund approves them, and then there are goals and targets that are laid out. And if those goals and targets are not met at the time frames that are agreed to at the beginning of the grant, then there are some things that happen, and I think the fund and its partners, meaning the other countries, come into play to try and help countries to meet those goals. But if it's just not working, or if we find that there are cases of corruption and other things where the money is not being used for what was for its initial purpose, the Global Fund actually has absolutely no problem discontinuing that funding for countries. And we've actually had several instances where that's happened. Uganda probably being the most kind of well-known. And obviously a darling of the development community. This was not an easy decision, but that money was not being used for what it needed to be used for, and the fund could not continue to fund that country. So the guiding principles, these are really the key things that the Global Fund focuses on. So as I said earlier, it is not an implementation organization. The goal of the Global Fund is to gather massive amounts of resources from the world to then finance these programs that are country-led. What's also interesting about the fund is, because of its multilateral nature, countries that contribute to it are actually leveraging their funds. So one of the tools that we use in the U.S. To really motivate lawmakers to contribute to the fund is, for every dollar that the Global Fund that the U.S. puts into the Global Fund, 2 additional dollars come out of other countries. And that was actually something that we worked on in PEPFAR 1, and that was to really ensure that this was in fact a global fund and not a U.S. fund for global health. Again, another unique thing about the fund is that we really let the countries decide their priorities. So the process in which they go is very different than sort of a traditional bilateral program, in that countries. Basically, there are mechanisms that are set up by countries, and probably the most important within the Global Fund process is something called the Country Coordinating Mechanism. And that is, in its best state, sort of a group of all the important stakeholders in the country. So it's government, it's NGOs, it's faith-based organizations, it's the private sector, it's all the individuals and organizations that have a stake in these three diseases come together and they work on a proposal. That proposal is then sent up to something called the Technical Review Panel, which is an independent entity that basically reviews all of the grant proposals that are made to the fund and looks at them for scientific merit, technical merit, and to some extent really trying to make sure that if they are granted this money, that the countries can actually implement the programs that they have put out there. So again, it's very much a bottom-up approach, and I think, again, in the past, foreign aid programs have really been more from a top-down approach, and that is the approach that the President's emergency plan takes, where it's very much the U.S. government, although working very closely with the countries, but those things are really done sort of at the top level, and then the money goes down. The fund also really strives for a balance, both from a geographic perspective. So while the bulk of the money is targeted in Africa, again, unlike PEPFAR, these diseases are rampant everywhere, and so they are actually involved in, like I said, 136 countries, and that's actually another good point of leverage for the U.S. Contribution, in that the U.S. focuses the majority of their PEPFAR dollars in 14 and 15 focus countries, but their Global Fund contribution actually allows those U.S. dollars to go around the world and really work on the three diseases out, in addition to the 15 focus areas, but also much broader. And then obviously on interventions, it is not a treatment fund, it is not a prevention fund. It does all three, prevention, care, and treatment on all three diseases. And really, again, it is focused on what those countries really need. So if a country really feels like they need to focus on malaria eradication, it is it is an absolute opportunity for them to apply for that from the fund. And as long as it's scientifically sound and technically sound, the fund is able to approve those. Again, we talked a little bit about the technical review panel. It is an independent entity, and they sort of do this process, within their own context. And the decisions are actually not based on how much money the fund has. It's very much based on the technical merits of the grants that they get. And then obviously accountability. I think the fund is probably, in my experience, one of the most transparent and accountable organizations that exist, especially on global health. Their website, while a little hard to navigate. The reason it's hard to navigate is because you can find everything under the sun on that website, and they really this transparency and accountability piece was a very, very important part of their starting. So again, these are sort of their guiding principles, and in a lot of ways, what makes them very unique in the foreign aid and global health world. So quickly on results, since 2002, the Global Fund has had a dramatic impact on countries around the world. Actually, we just got recent numbers that it's actually committed over $11 billion to 136 countries around the world fighting these three diseases. And twice a year, the fund updates its numbers. And as of June of 2008, it's provided financing for the treatment of 175 million people on antiretrovirals for HIV, TB treatment for almost 4 million people, and then almost 60 million malaria treatments have been delivered through Global Fund financing. And overall, the fund as an entity provides about 20% of HIV/AIDS funding around the world, but actually on malaria and TB, it is far ahead of any other donor, providing 65% of TB treatment and 75% of malaria treatment worldwide. So on those other two diseases, it is clearly the leader in financing those programs. So what's the role of the U.S.? Obviously, the U.S. has a huge program called PEPFAR. The Global Fund is part, we like to say it's the multilateral arm of the bilateral program. And as I said, historically, the U.S. has provided about a third of all funding to the Global Fund, and this is a cap that was created within the first PEPFAR bill, where only a third of the overall money going to the Global Fund could actually be from the United States, and that was, in some ways, when we did that, or when that was done, it was very much about ensuring that, again, it would not become a U.S. Global Fund. And now, what has happened is the U.S. contribution is actually slowly going down. It used to be at around 32, 33%. It's actually down to 28%. And that's because other countries have really kicked into high gear. And it's not just countries. We actually have a lot of new private sector involvement. So again, this is a good, when we get into the advocacy piece, this is a good pressure point that we use, is that we want to maintain that 1/3 participation in the fund. So in FY09, which is the appropriations process that we'll be going through for the fiscal year 2009, which we're about to go into, but there will be something called a continuing resolution where the funding will stay sort of at the levels that they are right now, and then hopefully after the election they'll make decisions on this. But in the beginning of this process, the fund was estimating that it required about $5 billion in the year 2009 to do what it needed to do on these three diseases. So again, taking 1/3 of that, Friends and our partner advocacy groups are really supporting $1.65 billion from the U.S. And if you remember my other slide, that's a pretty significant increase from what we got last year, which was $841 million. So that's a pretty big jump, and we really fought hard. And again, that's on appropriations, but on what is called reauthorization, which many of you may know we just passed in the Congress and the President signed at the end of July, which was to sort of re-up the PEPFAR program for another 5 years, which was for actually $48 billion, up from about the 20 that we will spend at the end of the first part of this program. But within that process, we were able to get an authorization for about $2 billion for the Global Fund. And then for each year following, it would sort of what we in Washington speak call such sums as necessary, which means as the needs of the Global Fund increase, that we are able to try and increase that number. But again, it's important to realize that there's two different processes going on. One is authorization, which is about creating the policy framework, and then in the end, it's always about the appropriators making the decisions around funding. So even though $2 billion was authorized, we have to, it's a whole different process to actually get $2 billion appropriated. And then, as I mentioned, again, for every $1 that the U.S. gives, other countries have provided $2. So that gives you a little bit of background on the fund. Let's talk about Friends for a few minutes. So our mission is up there, and our goal is really to educate and persuade policymakers in Washington to support the fund in the fight against the three diseases. We were founded in a very interesting way, actually, and it was probably about a year after the fund was around, and it was soon after the president announced PEPFAR. And my founder and chairman, Ed Scott, was actually at an event in Davos, Switzerland for the World Economic Forum, and he was listening to the then executive director of the Global Fund and former President Clinton and a few others talking about global AIDS and the Global Fund, and he really felt like this Global Fund was really the way forward, and it was, in order for it to succeed, and I think he was absolutely right, that the U.S. had to really be have a stake in the fund. And the U.S. was involved in its creation and and continues to sit on its board and all of that, but the glitch in all of this was the bilateral program. And at the time, there was, competition, misunderstanding. There was a lot of difficulty between the two entities. And Ed really felt like, if this fund is to succeed, we got to make sure that, as he likes to say, that the U.S. is being cared and fed to all the information they need from the U.S., from the fund. So he actually, he is a former Silicon Valley person, and he went up to his hotel room and he wrote a check to the Global Fund for $1 million. And he told Richard Feacham, who's the ED at the time, you can do whatever you want with this money, but what I'd like you to do, if you could, is create an office in Washington that will really kind of be the liaison between decision makers and you all. And the fund wasn't able to do that. One of the rules that was created is that the fund sits in Geneva and Geneva alone. They have no country offices, whether it's in the developing world or donor countries. So Ed said, okay, well, you can keep your $1 million, but I'm just going to start this organization. And that's how Friends was born. And it's actually a pretty amazing story because with Ed's idea, we now actually have, there are 6 Friends networks around the world, 6 Friends organizations around the world. Friends US and Japan kind of were born at around the same time, and we're very similar in nature because, again, we're in donor countries, and our goal is really to ensure that those funds continue for the fund. But we've also we have a Friends of the Global Fund Africa. There is a Friends of the Middle East, Friends of Global Fund Middle East being created. Friends South Asia, which will be based in India, is actually going to be launched at the Global Fund's next board meeting in November. And there's a Friends Europe and a Friends Australia that is on its way as well. So again, when we talk about models of advocacy, I think the Friends network in and of itself is actually a very unique and interesting kind of model. But so that's really where we came from, and you know, again, our primary objective is really to be working with you know, with policymakers and our fellow advocates to ensure that the U.S. continues to be the kind of supporter. I mean, clearly from the slides before, you know, without that U.S. support, there's no way that the fund would be able to be as impactful as it has been, and that needs to continue. And, you know, while Jean said that, you know, we are a fully independent organization of the Global Fund, we are not officially linked to them in any way, we have a very special relationship with them. And we really try to take that relationship and also be a good partner to the many organizations that are actually partners in supporting the Global Fund as well. But what Friends does actually is a little bit unique in that not only are we sort of up on the hill and asking for money and that sort of thing, but as the fund has gotten older and has done more things, the questions around it are getting more and more. You know, what exactly are you doing? You know, if we give you $100 million less, what does that mean for the Global Fund? And there's a lot of detailed policy issues that now come up, and I think as we move into this next phase with a new administration and new members of Congress, this level of scrutiny, because of these tight budgets that we will absolutely start seeing, I mean, we're seeing them now, our role becomes even more important because the fund can't be in the United States all the time, and we really serve as that conduit to provide staff and the members the kind of information they need so that they can continue funding the fund in the kind of way that they have. So this gives a little bit of a timeline on U.S. funding. So, you know, prior to PEPFAR, you know, the Clinton administration, and, you know, to be fair, I think that it's a bit unfortunate that I think the Clinton administration has gotten a lot of criticism for not doing more on global AIDS, and I think to some extent, you know, that is a fair statement. However, at the time, I don't think the issue was as big as it is now, and in a couple slides we'll talk a little bit about what made Global Fund so different, you know, as far as foreign aid goes. But you know, within by 2000 there was about $1.4 billion allocated to fighting global AIDS, and then, you know, in 2003, obviously PEPFAR came along, and I can just tell you a little personal story that the day that the president announced it, at the State of the Union, I was actually meeting with the individual who is now the Global AIDS Coordinator, and he was very much involved in the announcement, and I was at Glazer at the time, and we asked him, is the president going to be doing anything on these issues? And he was like, oh, you know, and sort of really played it off. And we all in the community have our stories about, you know, sitting in bed or sitting on our couch, and we're like, did we hear that right? 15 billion for AIDS? And it was pretty shocking. And again, very, you know, the politics around it are actually interesting. I mean, you would never expect an individual, like the president we have, to be focused on this issue. And again, the next slide will really talk about kind of what made AIDS sort of different. So we had PEPFAR, and then he continued his support for global health by announcing the President's Malaria Initiative in 2005, which was a $1.2 billion program over 5 years to work to diminish malaria cases, again, in 15 countries, and also a very close partner of the Global Fund. Did you have a question? Oh, sure, I'm sorry. And if I start breaking out into weird acronyms that people don't understand, please ask. PEPFAR stands for the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. And PMI is President's Malaria Initiative. So, between these two initiatives, there was just a massive amount of resources pooled together for global health. And then, as I said, the actual reauthorization of PEPFAR will end in 2009. And so for the past year, Congress, the administration, and many of the advocates have been focusing on getting PEPFAR reauthorized. And when it was first authorized, it was a $15 billion program. In the end, by 2009, we will have actually spent $20 billion. So Congress increased that amount by almost $5 billion. A lot of that increase actually went to the Global Fund because the president had very high levels for his bilateral program and pretty much left the Global Fund in his budget request between, it started at 200, went to 300, this year was at 500. So again, this is a real testament to the congressional support for increasing that money and also a lot of the advocacy work that went on to increase those dollars. But the newly reauthorized bill is for $48 billion. If I'm going to remember my numbers right, $5 billion for TB, $4 billion of that for malaria, and the rest going to AIDS. Okay, so to me this is a very, those of us that have been working on this, what happened with global AIDS? What made it so different that, we got all this attention and this sort of huge transformation on the part of foreign aid in the U.S.? I think there's a number of reasons. What's sort of interesting is, the people that this money goes to, they don't live in the U.S., they don't vote. And there is not really a natural constituency for this group. We do have things, I think the One campaign has done a tremendous job in really building a constituency around fighting issues related to poverty in Africa. But, that's new. That came with this interest. Lawmakers generally, they don't have a lot of interaction with people who are suffering from AIDS, TB, and malaria. Probably not many in the U.S. and, for the most part, definitely not in the developing world. But I think, like I said, it was a very interesting time of sort of strange bedfellows coming together. You had very, liberal, individuals saying this is something we have to do as a country. People are dying. Communities are being decimated. Generations are being wiped out. The U.S. has to do something. And then you had this very socially conservative religious movement basically making the same argument. And it was really the first time I've ever seen an issue sort of two totally different sides coming together. And it's not to say that they don't have their differences on particular policies, but the idea of really pushing the agenda on global AIDS because it was a moral, we had to do it morally, economies were dying. There were all sorts of reasons that were just being pushed from all different sides. The economic and security issues came up, and then, of course, there was the celebrity component, which, again, on international issues, we had never really seen, and Bono really kind of took that lead in getting very educated himself and really starting with the debt movement prior to this, but then getting very involved in global AIDS and development overall in Africa. So, at the time, lawmakers were really confronted by a lot of different constituencies of their own about doing something, and this is sort of what happened. And what we saw over the last 5 years was just a tremendous amount of attention to international health, and again, very interesting. And I think that in a new administration, and I'm sure many of you have seen that, the domestic AIDS problem sort of stopped getting a lot of attention, and I think that's going to change. But basically, with these different factors, things really started to change in Washington. And this next slide really talks about, and this is specific to the fund, the amount of sort of bipartisan support that we've seen for global health. But the people up here have been, huge supporters of the Global Fund from the very beginning. And, again, very different parts of the aisle. And kind of my favorite story, when I started at Friends, our two biggest champions were Dick Durbin from Illinois and Rick Santorum from Pennsylvania. And I don't know how many people know about Rick Santorum's politics, but not really considered somebody who is socially progressive, let's say. And I couldn't believe the amount of support that we had received from his staff and from him directly. I mean, in our office, we like to say he was like a dog with a bone. He was fully committed to the work of the Global Fund, and quite frankly, he had no constituency supporting him in Pennsylvania to do this stuff. This was a very personal issue for him, and he really, and to some extent, I mean, he was being attacked by some of his own base. I mean, there's a big issue that occurred last year, or 2 years ago now, with some of the social conservatives attacking some of the work of the Global Fund. And these are people that Rick Santorum really depends on. And he was quite open with the fact that, he was there to support the Global Fund and they could sort of do whatever they wanted, but he was not going to stop that support. So that's, pretty unique. And when he left the Senate, it was a big loss for the fund. Again, lots of bipartisan support. Both McCain and Obama have talked about global health as part of their agenda. And actually, when we have sort of disease days, and on World Malaria Day in April, Senator Obama actually included supporting the Global Fund as part of his malaria initiative in his statement. So again, both candidates are interested. So advocacy. At Friends, we have, as I said, we have a very specific goal in mind every year, and just to sort of break it down, I mean, let's just use the appropriation goal. I mean, these are really the points that I think are integral to any advocacy strategy. You got to figure out what you want to do. And then when you figure out what you want to do, you have to look at, well, what do I have to do that with? For us at Friends, our tools, we're a small organization, 6 people, and we have, 2 departments basically that work on this, policy and communications, and I'll talk a little bit more about what they do. But for us, our tools are really, our knowledge about the fund, our ability to bring in the Global Fund when we need to in Washington to meet with folks and provide the kind of information that really only they can provide. And then, using important spokespeople, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Our audience. When Friends first started, actually, our audience was actually a lot bigger. It was not only a decision makers, but it was the American public, too. We went through a strategic planning process last year, and we figured out that a 6-person organization could never educate the American public about some, random multilateral in Geneva. So we changed our mission a little bit and really felt like our our niche was really around focusing on those in Washington. And we partner, we believe that educating the public about what the Global Fund does is incredibly important. So what we decided was we're going to use and partner with a lot of our other advocacy groups. The One Campaign is a perfect example. They have the infrastructure to go out. They have 2 million people that are part of their program. They can, send out emails about the Global Fund. And so it's really, we sort of see ourselves as sort of that hub of information for the Global Fund, but then as we want to get that word out to more people, we provide that information to the people that actually have access to a larger number of Americans. And then, it's about choosing your strategy and figuring out what your resources are and really what you can do. So, now what our goal is really to bring a laser-like focus on the Global Fund, and that's our political strategy. And we really, like I said, it's really about decision makers for us. So what kind of tools do we have? So, we have some of the information out here, and I would, recommend that people, if they're interested, to go to our website. I think it's sort of a mound of information. But what we really do is we create a lot of information for the Global Fund. The fund has a lot of information on their own website, but again, their audience is very different from our audience. What Hill staffers and members of Congress have the patience for and have the attention span for is very different than what the Global Fund actually produces. So we produce a lot of one-pagers, and we do a lot of meetings with staff and members, and really showing them, not only giving them paper with the information, but also bringing in individuals from the field who can tell their own story, who can talk about the impact that Global Fund funding has had on a program that they're running or themselves. They may have been an individual who, was suffering from HIV, and through a program in their community that was funded by the fund, they were able to get tested and now have access to antiretrovirals that are basically saving their lives. Grassroots, again, we don't really do that. As I said, our mission is really more about grass tops, which is sort of the decision makers, but again, we serve as that hub for that information. Media outreach is incredibly important in this. Again, members of Congress are sort of bombarded with information, and one of our goals is to make sure that one of the ways that they get their information is through the periodicals and things that they watch on TV and things that they read. So communications and media is a big part of what we do. We've talked a little bit about partnerships and coalition building. And then obviously the celebrity and spokespeople. We have a pretty high-powered board, and we've been very lucky in that many of them have their own relationships with members directly, and they're very willing to use those relationships to help our cause. And when we were founded, this was sort of a big part of our founding. Jack Valenti, who is a original Texan, and his actual last job was the head of the Motion Picture Association, and obviously a very well-known individual in the country, but extremely well-known in Washington. And he was the president of our organization, and up until he died. And Jack's voice and work on the Global Fund, absolutely helped it get to the position that it's in right now. So PEPFAR. We talked a little bit about what it was, but I want to talk a little bit about what we did on that issue. So PEPFAR reauthorization, we knew that it was going to, we were planning for it last year actually, and there was a lot of concern about whether it would actually go through and all of that. And obviously this is a bill, that's probably a couple hundred pages long, and lots of advocates were working on it. But again, Friend's particular interest and goal was really to ensure, one, that the funding authorization for the fund was as high as possible and was appropriate as well, but also to make sure that the policies that would be in the bill regarding the Global Fund would be appropriate. So let's just talk a little bit more about that. The Global Fund, couple years ago faced some issues around transparency and accountability. And again, that was a place where Friends was really on the front line of sort of setting the record straight with members. And this issue of transparency and accountability was sort of picked up on by some of our, some folks that aren't so supportive of the Global Fund. And we really wanted to make sure that there were not benchmarks, things that could be put into the bill that would actually withhold funding from the Global Fund. We actually have withholding language for the Global Fund that's within the appropriations side of things, and which we meet every year. But we wanted to make sure that people weren't really putting bad policies in that would make it almost impossible for the fund to be able to do what they need to do. And so we spent a lot of time working with both the House and the Senate committees to ensure that what they needed was able to go in the bill, but doing it in such a way that the fund wouldn't be penalized for it. So, and a lot of the things were very technical issues. And again, this is where Friends really took the lead on this. And again, and very laser-like, I mean, this bill was a $48 billion bill. The Global Fund was $2 billion of that. 200-page bill, you know, our section was maybe 3 or 4 pages. But had we not been doing that work, you know, I'm convinced that there would have been benchmarks in there that basically would have withheld 20% of its overall funding. And when you're talking about 20% of $841 million, that's not a small amount of money. So,
so an example of what the
benchmarks? Sure, and hopefully they're not sort of too technical. And it's interesting because the benchmarks, to some extent, I mean, the political dynamic is very interesting between the Global Fund and the administration. It's incredibly positive now. I think the relationship between the fund and fund's leadership and the Office of the Global AIDS Coordinator's leadership, extremely good. They work very closely together, both on the macro level, but also in country. But that's changed over. I mean, that was a change from what it was. And I actually think that my predecessor and Jack actually had a lot to do with making that relationship stronger. But the U.S. sits on the board of the Global Fund, and there are some things that they would like the Global Fund to do, and other board members aren't so keen on that. And so a really good example is something called the comprehensive funding policy. So when the fund was first created, the U.S. Was very strong, and a lot of countries believe this too, that if you are going into if you're going to start treating people for HIV, you better make sure that you have all the money you need to actually do this, because we can't be put in a situation where you've agreed to put people in South Africa on antiretrovirals for 2 years, and then you run out of money, and then you're basically killing people. So it was a very, very strong push to ensure that when the Global Fund signs a grant, that it has that money in the bank, so that throughout the life of that grant, it's there. Now, what's interesting is that, so what happens is that money sits in the bank for a little while. And, we get a lot of comments for people that on the Hill that may not know a lot, but they're hearing, well, the Global Fund's got all this money sitting in the bank. Why don't you use that before you start asking us for more money? Well, yeah, it is sitting in the bank, but that money's committed for programs. And quite frankly, the U.S. was the one who wanted that in there. So, but there are others on the board that feel like there are ways to sort of make the comprehensive funding policy less stringent. So you actually start using some of the money that's in the bank to do additional programs. And the U.S. is very, very against it. And to be fair, there's lots of other seats on the board that are also against it. So that was something that was being pushed by a number of members, that you have to have this comprehensive funding policy in place, as strong as it is now, and you have to prove that that's there, and if it's not there, we're going to withhold 20% of your funding. And the reason why the fund wasn't so keen on that was because the discussion of that policy, the Secretariat wasn't taking a position on whether the comprehensive funding policy was the right policy or the wrong policy. But the point is that policy needs to be decided by the board, not by a member of the board through their legislation. So we really pushed back. We didn't want to kind of close that discussion that was actually in process at the board. So we helped, sort of soften that language. And in reality, what the end bill, I actually think in the final bill, we were actually able to take that particular benchmark off. But these were things that were coming up, and so that's one that we were able to work on. But a lot of the things were very technical in nature, and that's why, again, I'm actually pretty sure that most of the advocates that are very strong Global Fund supporters weren't really involved in some of those activities. So in addition to sort of all the work we did, with the staff, we did a number of meetings with, staff, but also members. We were able to bring Michelle Kazachkine, who's the executive director of the Global Fund, to testify in front of the Foreign Relations Committee last December to talk about the fund's role in fighting these three diseases and the support it needed as we were going through the PEPFAR reauthorization process. So, I feel pretty comfortable that if Friends hadn't really advocated on behalf of the Global Fund, I think that the final situation would have actually been pretty different and probably not as good for the fund. So our tools. So as I said, we have two departments. We have policy and communications. And really, our policy team is two people, and one of them has quite a lot of extensive experience on Capitol Hill on the House side, and again, really working to write these papers, and some of them are very much, this is what we need in 2009, but then we also do sort of broader policy papers, and one good example is I mentioned that there were a number of pretty well-known religious groups that were attacking the Global Fund, and first it was on some things that they were doing which actually weren't true, and then their next complaint, which I think was valid to some extent, was that faith-based organizations have not really been as involved in the Global Fund process as some would like, considering the amount of work they do on global health in Africa especially. So what Friends did, because we were hearing a lot of that on Capitol Hill, not only did we sort of work with staff and members on it, but we actually did a whole report and we worked with World Vision, a faith-based organization that actually serves a major part of takes on a big role in the Global Fund, and that's a principal recipient for a number of grants that the Global Fund gives out. So World Vision and Data, which used to be one, or one used to be Data, and we basically put out a manual that helped faith-based organizations around the world understand the fund better and help them kind of move forward in a process where they said, okay, this is what we have to do. And I feel pretty strongly that it needed to happen on both ends. I think that the Global Fund needed to reach out more and do more education to these groups that were doing this work, but it also required, because again, the fund is a financing organization. It's about giving away money. It's not about implementation. And so in order to get money, organizations need to organize themselves and work together to try and work through this process. So we work on sort of larger policy issues too. And then our communications work really supports that. So, again, when Michelle Kazachkine is in the United States, in addition to setting up meetings with him in Washington with members and think tanks and things like that, we're also making sure that he's having desk side briefings with key reporters so that they know what's going on, and also to make sure that the fund's voice is heard in different press pieces that are being done. So we sort of talked a little bit about this. So again, on policy, this is really, we have extremely strong relationships on the Hill. We try to provide any information that they need as quickly and as accurately as possible. And then obviously, as I said, we've got our policy team who's got a lot of legislative experience. And communications, again, media outreach, information, also providing those spokespeople so that if a reporter is doing a story on TB, we want to make sure that the TB expert at the Global Fund is put in touch with that reporter to ensure that they're getting the information that they need. And on advertising, sometimes what we do, which is, again, we have to be careful about how we incorporate lobbying into our work, because we are a 501c3, but a lot of people think that nonprofits actually can't lobby. That's actually not true. You just have to minimize the amount that you lobby, but you can. And every once in a while, we will put out an ad in Roll Call, which is a very well-read Hill newspaper, whether it's thanking members for passing a piece of legislation or sort of pushing them to do that. That's another sort of tool that we have in our toolbox. This is just a smattering of some of the partners that we work with in Washington, and again, it's fundamental on our side to have really good partners on both the policy and communications piece. To ensure that the Global Fund in the end really gets the results that they need. So just wanted to give you guys another case study, which is actually one of my favorite stories of being with friends. This was a couple of years ago when our president, Jack Valenti, and I were in South Africa. And he and I were on a Global Fund trip, and it was right around the time where the full committee on appropriations was making decisions about the Global Fund, and the subcommittee had provided, I think $500 million or $600 million, and we were working to try and get an amendment to bump that number up. And we had done a ton of stuff with the staff. We were actually working very, very closely with data at the time to really get this number up. And Jack, we had made a call to an individual named Senator DeWine, who was on the full committee, and we needed somebody. Basically, Dick Durbin was very interested in being a sponsor of that amendment, but we needed a Republican on board, and Santorum is not on the committee, so we needed someone from the committee. And Jack had made a call to Senator DeWine, and it was really, I think the first call was made. The call was made the day before the markup. And I got a call on my cell phone. Actually, my policy director called me and said, let's just try one more time. Maybe Jack can just make one more call. So we were literally in a very remote part of Durban, South Africa, and we were in a spinach patch. And I should have put the picture in here, because we have a picture of it too. Jack made the call, and we're like, okay. And it was about 6 o'clock in the evening in Durban, and my cell phone rings. And Jack and I are talking to one of the farmers that is basically, it's a Global Fund project where Global Fund money is going into food creation. And then that food, those farmers would then feed their families, but also provide that money, provide that food to other people that were on antiretrovirals. And the phone rings, and I pick it up, and it's Jack's assistant, and she's like, I have Mike DeWine on the phone for Jack. And I said, okay. And I pulled Jack away, and I said, DeWine's on the phone for you. And he's like, okay. And he went aside, and I was trying not to be rude to the farmer, but I wanted to hear what was going on. And I don't know if any of you have ever met Jack or heard Jack, but he has a very distinctive way of speaking, and he's like, Mike, you're not going to believe where I am right now. I'm in Durban, South Africa, and I'm looking at this project. And he literally went on for about 2 minutes talking about what he was looking at. And Mike's like, you're really in South Africa right now? And he's like, yeah. And he goes, I know you have a lot of commitments, but I have to tell you, this $100 million, it's really going to make a difference. Just please do what you can. And that was Jack's way. He never pushed hard, gave the information, and said, in the end, it's your decision. Phone gets hung up. And our work was done. There was nothing we can do. 30 minutes later, I get a phone call from my policy director saying, Mike DeWine just stood up, offered the amendment in the full committee. Not only that, Durbin agreed, and Senator Brownback, who is not exactly someone who really supports the Global Fund that much, says, I want in on that too. And the chairman of the Appropriation Committee agreed. It was done by voice vote, and the Global Fund ended up with $724 million. And it was, and again, I was away, and only later, actually just this past year, I was in a meeting with a woman who was on the other side of that phone with Mike DeWine. And she said it was an unbelievable moment because he was really not sure what he was going to do. And he's like, if Jack's saying this and he's there, I got to do it. And it worked. It was pretty amazing. And I think that is the power of having strong spokespeople. And and I think Bono has done things like that, and I think that it is that interest by these very high-profile people with the relationships that has helped. I mean, I think the one thing I will say though is that in the end, it's the members' decision, and I think that what we've seen in the last 5 years is just an incredible amount of support for these programs, by members, and tons of people are going on CODELs to different places to see what's going on. So we've really seen an amazing shift happen on these issues. In my opinion, I think when you're thinking about advocacy, I hope that people think about sort of what are the tools that you have and what's really needed considering the audience you have, and really based on that and what your strengths are, moving forward in that direction. So that's really it. I'm happy to take questions.